Hi, my name is Dr. Ariana Tartzelman, and I am a clinical neuropsychologist at Swedish Neuroscience Institute in Seattle, Washington. I work here in the neurology department and specifically in the Center for Healthy Aging. And today I'm going to be talking to you about problem solving and planning. So as part of the lecture today, we're going to go over what exactly is problem solving. What are the associated brain areas? How do we actually use these skills in our everyday life? How do we measure these skills in a clinical or research setting? And what happens when things go wrong? When might that occur and what causes it to happen? So to start off, what is problem solving and planning ability? They're both considered facets or aspects of executive functioning. And executive functioning is an umbrella term that refers to higher level cognitive functions. They're usually associated with your frontal lobe functions, so right here in the front of your head. And it's things like planning, decision-making, goal-oriented behavior, being able to switch from one task to the next, to initiate appropriate or desired behavior, or to inhibit undesirable or inappropriate behavior. So again, it's these higher cognitive abilities, and problem solving and planning ability are considered to be some of those higher level abilities. More specifically, planning is really the preparation or thinking about the actions required to achieve a particular goal. Problem solving, well, it requires a problem and there's no immediate or obvious solution. And there's a goal that needs to be achieved. So with problem solving, sometimes you can break it down into different parts. For example, identifying an actual problem or predicament. Sometimes we can determine the cause of the problem, sometimes we can't. Ideally, identifying and sometimes prioritizing possible solutions. So maybe we come up with multiple solutions and we can think about which one might be better, which one should we try first. And then actually implementing a solution or maybe multiple solutions. So as you can see here, problem solving is a little complicated and involves multiple steps or has different aspects to it. So what are some problems that might occur, in our everyday life? Well, there are a lot of problems. What is not a problem? This is just a slide of very common, frustrating, everyday problems. The straw is not long enough, the milk carton didn't open properly, the binder isn't lining up anymore, or you catch your pants on the door, right? These are just common everyday problems, but we still have to problem solve, right? We still have to identify the problem, try to think of a solution and implement it. What are other problems in our everyday life? Well, it could be something as simple as making a cup of coffee. There's actually a lot of steps associated with simply making a cup of coffee, and they all have to be done in the right order. So we really have to plan. That's where those planning abilities come into place. What are we going to do first? Running errands. Where are you going to go? You have to plan out, okay, how far is something? Do I have enough gas? Do I know how to get there? Prioritizing a to-do list. If you have a lot of different things to do, is there a way to plan your to-do list in a way that makes the most sense? Cooking. Cooking has a lot of problems that are associated with it. Getting the right ingredients, following a recipe. Let's say the butter in your recipe has to be, room temperature for this particular dish that you're making. Well, it's probably helpful for you to plan ahead of time that you need to take the butter out of the fridge and allow it time to get to room temperature before you start cooking. If you don't plan ahead, then the butter's too cold and it messes up your whole dish, right? Or let's say there's a recipe that calls for minced garlic, but you only have garlic powder. Is there a way to problem solve there? The recipe calls for half a cup of flour, but you only have a quarter cup measuring cup. Can you problem solve and figure out what you can do? In this case, you might quickly realize, oh, I could just do 2 scoops with my quarter cup, and that equals half a cup. So that was a pretty quick, problem solved in that situation. Planning a road trip. There's a lot of planning associated with something like that, all the logistics, all the different steps. And chances are you're going to come across a problem somewhere along the way that you might need to solve. For example, the first day, you didn't get out the door fast enough and you made a couple of stops that took longer than expected. And you're not going to get to that hotel that you plan to stay at that night. So what can you do? How can you problem solve in that situation? Which homework assignments should I complete first? These are, pretty simple everyday problems, but as we work through life, as we get older, sometimes our problems become more complex, and the problem solving associated and the planning associated can also become more complex. So for example, how should I pay off my student loans? How do I best resolve a work conflict or a relationship issue? How do I plan to take care of an aging parent? Or how best to remove a brain tumor? If any of you go on to become a neurosurgeon, that's a problem. Those are problems that you're going to be faced with every day, and you have to learn how to navigate those and to use those problem-solving abilities. Throughout our day, we plan tons of behaviors and we problem solve all the time, sometimes maybe without even realizing it, to the extent that we're engaging in it. And there are certain brain areas that help us to do these things, to help us problem solve and help us plan. So the associated brain areas, when we think about problem solving and planning in particular, a lot of people usually think of the prefrontal cortex right here in the front of your brain, that frontal lobe that I mentioned earlier. So the PFC is usually associated with problem solving and planning behaviors, but there are a couple of other regions that are worth mentioning. So for example, the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC. So that's been implicated in several complex cognitive functions, such as empathy, impulse control, but also decision-making, problem solving. And then we also have areas such as the premotor cortex, the motor cortex, and the hippocampus that are associated with problem solving and planning. So if you think about planning movement, volitional movement, that's going to incorporate the premotor cortex and the motor cortex. You have to think about how when you're planning things, it could be something that you're going to say. It could be something that you're going to physically do, right? And so depending on what you're planning or depending on what type of problem you're solving, you're not only going to use your prefrontal cortex. You may use these other brain regions as well. So for example, you might also use, or implicate the hippocampus, which is the area of our brain that's typically associated with memory. How do you remember that? Well, if you saw a hippo walking across campus, you probably wouldn't forget. So let's go back to the example that I talked about with cooking, right? You're following this recipe and it wants you to use minced garlic. Well, what if you don't remember that you have the garlic powder? Then you can't really problem solve with the garlic powder. But if your hippocampus is functioning and you're able to remember, oh yeah, in the pantry I have my garlic powder, having that memory, having the knowledge of that information is going to actually help you problem solve in that situation. So the PFC is, the kind of primary area that we think of, but there are other brain areas that communicate with the PFC and work in tandem to help us plan or solve problems. So when we're using these brain areas and we're engaging in problem solving and planning abilities, things are going well, and sometimes those processes can go awry. So we need to be able to measure these processes to better understand things like problem solving and planning, to see, are they intact? Are things going well? Or are there any problems? And there are several different ways in which we can measure these abilities, both in a clinical context, also in a research context. So I'm going to go over some of the tests. This isn't an exhaustive list of ways in which we can measure problem solving and planning abilities. One of the tests is called the Wisconsin card sorting test. And this is a task that can be administered with physical cards or on the computer. And it's great because you can give it to kids, adults, or you can even use the modified version for older adults. And this is a test that helps to assess abstract verbal reasoning and problem solving. So you have the 4 cards at the top that remain the same throughout the test. And then you're shown a card on the bottom and you're told to pair it with one of the 4. And as you can see here, there's a lot of different ways you could go about pairing. You could pair based on color, red with red, based on the shape, cross with cross. You could pair based on the number of the objects. So there's 2, for example, in this case. But you have this problem. Your goal is to pair it with the correct card. You have to pick a strategy. You have to come up with a solution and you have to implement it and just see what happens. And with this test, you get feedback if you're right or wrong. And so that helps you to modify your strategy to figure out how to do well in the test. Now, part of the way through the test, the rules will actually change, and you have to be able to adapt or respond to adjust your problem solving in order to do well on the test. Another test that we have is called the Tower test, and there are multiple different versions: the DCAS Tower test, Tower of London, or the CANTAB, which is a computer test that stands for the Cambridge Neuropsychological Test Automated Battery. And even though there's different names, all the Tower tests work in the same way. They're designed to measure your spatial planning and problem solving abilities. You have these 3 pegs of equal height and either balls or discs on them. They can be different colors or different sizes. And the discs or the balls are arranged in a particular way at the beginning. And then you're shown a picture of what your final goal is, what you want them to look like at the end. But you're given some rules to follow. So for example, you can only pick up 1 disc or 1 ball at a time. You can't put a smaller one underneath a bigger one. So you have to actually plan out your steps and figure out how to problem solve in order to accomplish the goal, to try to get the right end result. Another test we have is called the category test, and there's a short category test and a booklet category test, which is just a little bit longer. And it's similar to the Wisconsin card sorting test, where you're shown these images and you have to pick the right answer, come up with a strategy, and then you're given feedback. Are you right or wrong? And that will help you to engage in problem solving and come up with your strategy and maybe tweak your strategy if necessary, for example, if you're getting the wrong answers. Another test, this is one of my favorite tests, is called the Zoo Map test. And it's a simple, fun test where you tell someone that they're going to the zoo that day, and they have to plan out a particular route. So you tell them that they need to visit certain areas in the zoo, but they're given rules to follow. They have to start at the entrance and they have to finish at the picnic area. They're allowed to use the shaded paths as many times as they would like, but they can only use the unshaded paths once, and they can only take 1 camel ride. So then people have to plan their route to figure out how can they follow all of the different rules and visit each of the places they're supposed to visit in an efficient and logical manner without violating any of the rules. So you have to problem solve, right? And when we're looking at this test, we look at how much time people take to do the test. We look at different errors that they make. And it can be really informative regarding somebody's planning and problem-solving abilities, just like the other tests that I showed you. Another way of measuring planning and problem-solving behavior is with a questionnaire rather than a test. So we have one questionnaire that we use pretty often, even though there are others, called the BRIEF, the Behavior Rating Inventory of Executive Function. And this is great because unlike the tests, there's a lot of different versions of this questionnaire, and you can get a report from different perspectives regarding somebody's executive functioning. Remember how we talked about planning and behavior and problem solving as part of executive functioning. So you can get a report from somebody's parent, from another adult in their life, be a teacher if it's a kid. You can also get somebody's self-report, so how they view their own problem solving and planning ability. And you can really get at different facets or different components of these more complex cognitive functions. So why do we have to measure or assess problem solving or planning abilities? Well, as I mentioned before, sometimes these processes go awry and they don't work as they should. So when or why do things go wrong? Well, they can go wrong for a lot of different reasons. This is just a few of them. This isn't an exhaustive list, but for example, somebody might get into a motor vehicle collision and their head gets hit really hard and they experience a traumatic brain injury. And so their brain is injured and no longer functioning the way that it used to function. Maybe somebody has an underlying neurodegenerative process, such as a type of dementia, like frontotemporal dementia or Lewy body dementia. Maybe they have Parkinson's disease. All of these diseases and processes can affect our ability to problem solve or plan our behaviors. You could get an infection, you could have a seizure disorder like epilepsy, or you could simply be on a medication that has side effects that impair your problem solving and planning ability. So what does it look like when things go wrong from a functional standpoint? Well, remember when we talked about all of those problems that happen on a daily basis before? When individuals are having difficulty problem solving and planning, all of these daily behaviors and problems become harder. So maybe somebody is having trouble paying their bills, so they're making mistakes. They're not able to calculate the right amount of their bill that they need to pay, or it's a late payment, or they forget to check how much money is in their account at the current time, and they pay their bill and the money's not really there. And they're just not able to problem solve in that situation what they could do. Driving. So driving takes a lot of planning. We also have to, problem solve at multiple occasions while driving. Maybe people get lost or they start taking indirect routes. Cooking. This is another just, common aspect of daily living that we can see impairment or reduced performance when somebody has impaired problem solving or planning abilities. So they might start making things out of order. They may use the wrong, ingredients or the wrong amounts of ingredients. And it's difficult for them to figure out what to do in the moment. They might even become overwhelmed, with more complex problems or show changes in their behavior. They might become impulsive because they're no longer planning out certain behaviors carefully. So when these processes go awry, we can see a lot of changes to function, but also daily behaviors. So it's important to use those measures that I showed you before to actually measure somebody's problem solving and planning abilities so that we can see, are they intact? Are they doing well in those areas? Or are those areas now a weakness for them that we can then address by using different recommendations and interventions? So that wraps up our talk regarding problem solving and planning behaviors. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much.